Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey to ancient Greece to uncover the entire history of Zeus, king of the gods, wielder of thunder, and ruler of Olympus. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you as a fellow knight of these tales to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or myths you would have us explore next. Now let us begin. To really understand Zeus, we have to begin with his father, Cronus, because the story makes little sense without that first step. Cronus had already overthrown his own father, Uranus, and from the very start he carried the fear that power once seized could be taken again. A prophecy warned him that one of his own children would rise against him, and instead of trusting to chance he decided to act before the danger could take shape. Each time Rhea, his partner, gave birth, he swallowed the infant whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades and Poseidon all disappeared this way, never tasting milk, never being placed in a cradle. The halls of Cronus's household were strangely quiet, and Rhea lived with grief that never faded, because a mother remembers each child taken from her arms. When she carried another child, her sorrow turned into determination. She wanted this one to live, and so she sought counsel from Gaia, the ancient presence who had seen many ages turn. Together they formed a plan. The child would be born in secret, and Cronus would be deceived with something else in its place. It was a plan built not on strength but on cunning, and it offered a small path of hope. The place chosen for this deception was the island of Crete, far from the seats of power where Cronus ruled. Crete stood apart in the sea, its distance offering safety, because news travelled slowly across water and few eyes from the court ever looked that far. High in its slopes lay a cavern that could only be reached by narrow paths, where each step had to be placed with care. Inside, the stone walls were cool, and the air stayed steady, even when the sun beat down on the hills. For Rhea, the cavern's silence was its greatest gift, because it muffled sound and kept secrets. She chose it not for comfort but for safety, and safety was what mattered most. No herald of Cronus would likely set foot there, and no Titan expected danger from a mother travelling alone to a distant island. In that hidden cave, Rhea gave birth to her child. He was named Zeus, and for the first time since the prophecy was spoken, the future shifted quietly away from Cronus's grasp. Several figures played their part in keeping the newborn alive. Adrastea and Ida, two nymphs, stood ready to raise the boy with steady care, and they became his first guardians. Amalthea, a goat, gave her milk freely, and her presence ensured the child would be fed. Rhea could not remain, because her absence would be noticed, so she trusted these caretakers with her son's life. Gaia, who had advised the plan, remained a distant guide, her wisdom present in the choice of concealment. Far away, Cronus continued his rule, unaware that the prophecy was still alive. Within him the swallowed children lingered, silent and waiting, though no one yet knew how they might be freed. For now the circle around Zeus was small, but it was enough. Two nymphs, a goat, a mother who came in secret, and an elder presence who had counselled the plan. This was the family that stood against the fear of a king, and their plain, persistent efforts carried more weight than any crown. The deception itself was simple but effective. Rhea wrapped a stone in cloth, shaping it to resemble an infant, and carried it back to Cronus. She offered it with steady hands, and Cronus, believing it was his newest child, swallowed it as he had the others. He did not look closer, nor did he question the act, because fear makes even a king eager to believe he is safe. In that moment, the plan succeeded. Cronus felt secure, thinking the prophecy delayed once more, and his halls continued in their old rhythm. Rhea returned, carrying her grief in silence, but also knowing that one child had escaped her partner's hunger. Back in the cavern, Adrastea and Ida rocked the true infant in their arms, and Amalthea fed him with her milk. The difference between a swallowed stone and a living child was greater than Cronus understood, and in that gap the future opened. These were still small beginnings, yet they marked the first step toward a change that would echo across ages. Life in the cave soon found its rhythm. The nymphs tended to Zeus each day, keeping him warm, clean, and comforted. Amalthea stood near, steady in her role, and her milk kept the boy strong. As the months passed, he learned to sit, then crawl, then stand on unsteady legs. The caretakers guided him gently, pulling him back when he wandered too far, and distracting him with smooth stones or scraps of cloth when his cries threatened to grow too loud. Rhea visited when she could, always careful not to leave traces of her absence. Cronus ruled far away, never questioning his own certainty that all his children were inside him. People later said that the stone he swallowed was set up as a reminder of that deception, though at the time it was only part of a desperate act. In the cavern, what mattered was consistency. Feed, guide, soothe, repeat. Those ordinary tasks shaped survival, and survival was enough to keep the prophecy alive. The meaning of these early years is plain. Zeus lived, and because he lived, the story could move forward. His survival was not loud, and it did not involve thunder or lightning, but it was more important than any battle that would follow. Cronus believed he had silenced the prophecy, but he had only been tricked, and the future was quietly growing in a cave far from his sight. The swallowed children remained inside him, silent but not erased, waiting for the day their story would return. Zeus, meanwhile, gained strength through care, patience, and small routines. Great events often begin with ordinary acts, and in this case the acts were swaddling, feeding, and keeping watch. For now, Zeus was a child hidden in Crete, and life continued in this way, steady and unnoticed, until the time came when concealment would no longer be enough. To follow Zeus's story, we need to stay in the cave on Crete for a while, because these hidden years shaped him more than any later tale of thunder or councils could. The danger from Cronus had not vanished, yet the distance of the island and the silence of its cavern gave the boy room to grow. His earliest life was not marked by splendor or feasts, but by the ordinary tasks that made survival possible. Adrastea and Ida, the nymphs who guarded him, and Amalthea, the goat who fed him, carried the burden of that duty each day. Rhea, his mother, visited when she could, though her steps were always careful and her time always short. Cronus, far away, remained certain that all his children had been swallowed, and he ruled without suspicion. This was the first real victory of the plan. Not only had Zeus survived, but he was beginning to thrive. The cave itself was now his world, and its stone walls and narrow entrance became the boundaries of his early experience. The air was cool in the mornings, carrying the smell of damp earth after rain. When Amalthea shifted her weight, the echo of her hooves bounced softly off the stone, and these familiar sounds became the music of his childhood. The paths outside were steep and twisting, and the nymphs rarely let him wander far, because every step away from the cavern increased the risk of being seen or heard. They kept their lives simple, avoiding smoke or noise that might draw attention, and in this plain routine they found safety. The cave did not look like much to outsiders, but it held more importance than any palace, because within it the prophecy remained alive. The household that formed around Zeus was small, but it functioned with the closeness of a family. Adrastea and Ida did not only feed and wash him, they shaped his habits, guiding him with patience so that he learnt the value of steadiness and order. Amalthea was more than an animal to him, because her milk and her constant presence gave him a sense of comfort that never wavered. Rhea remained the distant figure who tied him to the wider family of gods, and her brief visits reminded him that he was not forgotten. Cronus, meanwhile, never questioned the silence in his halls, and he believed the prophecy contained within himself. The swallowed siblings still waited in darkness, silent yet not gone, and though Zeus could not yet know them, their absence marked him. His world was small, but it was enough to sustain him, and those who loved him turned their duty into daily acts of care. Life in the cave moved with a rhythm, because rhythm was how survival worked. Meals were given at set times, rest was kept regular, and noise was managed with care. Zeus began to crawl, then to walk, steadying himself on the stone walls. When his laughter carried too far, the nymphs covered it with song or clapped in rhythm to drown the echo, because silence remained their greatest defense. Amalthea continued to provide milk until he was ready for other foods, and the boy grew taller and stronger with each passing season. Rhea saw these changes on her visits, and though she had to leave quickly, her heart lifted each time she saw her son standing firmer on his feet. Cronus still ruled without a thought of danger, which was proof that the deception was holding. In this balance of routine and watchfulness, Zeus gained the strength he would later need, even if at the time it looked like nothing more than a child's play. By the time Zeus had grown past infancy, he began to take on small tasks, and the nymphs trusted him with more freedom inside the cavern. He fetched water in small cups, carried pieces of wood for the hearth, and copied the motions of those who cared for him. These tasks gave him a sense of responsibility, even if he did not yet know why they mattered. The cave, once only a hiding place, became a school, where each simple chore taught him order, patience, and self-control. Outside, the island followed its natural cycles. Winds shifted, rains came and went, and the smell of sea salt drifted into the hills. Each season left its mark on him, and each year made him harder to hide, but the caretakers endured. Rhea saw not only her son but a boy who could one day fulfill the prophecy, and that vision gave her the strength to keep playing her dangerous role. These years may seem uneventful in the telling, but they were years when the prophecy held firm through the simplest of acts. The meaning of this time lies in the survival and steady growth of a child who was never meant to live. Nothing about his life in the cave was grand, yet everything about it mattered, because he was alive and learning. Cronus ruled as though nothing had changed, but his certainty was already broken, though he did not know it. The swallowed children remained silent inside him, waiting for release, while their youngest brother grew stronger each day. What looked like ordinary routines, feeding, guiding, quieting laughter, were the hidden victories that kept fate moving forward. This is how many great stories begin, not with thunder or armies, but with the quiet persistence of care. For now, Zeus's story was one of patience, duty, and silence, and life continued in this way, until the time came when hiding could no longer last. Now that Zeus had survived his first years in the cave, we can follow how those quiet beginnings shaped his growth into a boy with presence and strength. The danger from Cronus had not vanished, yet each passing season made the deception stronger, because the child was alive and learning in secret. His world was small, bounded by stone walls and the steady care of a few guardians, but within that world he gained the habits that would prepare him for the future. The prophecy still hung like a shadow over the family of Titans, though only a few knew it remained unbroken. Cronus believed himself secure, ruling with confidence as though nothing could touch him. But Rhea, Gaia, and the nymphs knew otherwise, and their work was to keep the boy safe while giving him the strength he would need when the time of concealment ended. This stage of the story matters, because it shows that survival was not enough. Growth, learning, and steady preparation were just as important. The cave and the island around it provided the setting for these years, and the environment left its mark on Zeus. The mornings were cool, and often carried the damp smell of earth after a rain, and those scents became part of his earliest memory. The sound of Amalthea's hooves echoed softly on the stone floor, a steady rhythm that gave the place a kind of heartbeat. Light filtered in through the mouth of the cave, shifting across the floor as the sun moved, and for a child who knew little else, that pattern of light and shadow defined the shape of a day. Beyond the cave, narrow paths wound down into valleys where reeds and grasses swayed, and sometimes the wind carried the smell of the sea into the hills. Yet for all of this, his guardians kept him close, because the risk of being seen remained too great. Every step away from the cave's safety had to be measured. In this way, the very walls of stone taught him boundaries, patience, and the discipline of waiting. Inside the cave, daily routines formed the core of his life, and through them he learned lessons that lasted beyond childhood. Adrastea and Ida gave him food and care at regular times, teaching him that order mattered even in a hidden life. They guided his play, choosing objects that were safe, a smooth stone to hold, a piece of wood to balance, or cloth to tug at. They quieted him when his voice grew too loud, reminding him that sound could travel and invite danger. In those gentle corrections, he learned self-control without harshness. Amalthea gave him more than milk. She gave him security, because she was always present, and children find strength in what never changes. Rhea, though she visited only rarely, showed him affection that linked him to something beyond the cave, a wider family waiting in silence. Even his swallowed siblings mattered, though he did not know them yet, because the absence of their company shaped his sense of solitude. This small circle became his household, and within it he found care, stability, and the beginnings of resilience. As he grew older, his abilities expanded, and each new step was both a triumph and a challenge for those who guarded him. He learned to walk across the uneven stone floor, then to climb small ledges near the cave's mouth, and finally to run short distances without falling. His laughter grew louder as he gained confidence, and the nymphs often sang or clapped in rhythm to mask the sound, turning a potential danger into another form of play. They showed him how to listen for the change of wind outside the cave, and how to notice the faint rustle of leaves when something moved nearby. These were small lessons, but they taught awareness, which would serve him later as much as any weapon. Rhea, when she visited, saw the difference each season made, and though she stayed only briefly, her hope grew stronger with each encounter. Cronus, still unaware, continued his rule, never suspecting that his supposed victory over fate had already failed. The deception remained unbroken, and each skill Zeus gained made the prophecy harder to erase. In time, the boy began to take part in simple tasks, because even in hiding there was work to be done. He carried small vessels of water, learned to stack pieces of wood near the hearth, and helped arrange herbs that the nymphs gathered. These chores were plain, but they gave him a sense of purpose, and taught him that even small efforts mattered. The cave was no longer only a place of shelter. It had become a place of learning, where responsibility grew alongside strength. Outside, the island followed its own rhythm, with winds shifting from sea to land, rains washing over the slopes, and the sun returning each season to the same paths in the sky. Each cycle of weather became another layer of knowledge for him, because he learned that life had patterns, and those patterns gave stability. Rhea's visits continued, and each time she saw a boy who was no longer fragile, but stronger and more certain in his steps. The swallowed siblings remained trapped inside Cronus, silent but not erased, and their presence in the story was like a pause waiting to be resolved. For Zeus, the lesson was clear: Even if he could not yet speak it, survival required patience, duty, and quiet strength. The meaning of these years lies in their steadiness. Zeus did not yet strike with thunder, nor did he sit upon a throne, but he grew in silence and in order. The nymphs taught him patience and discipline. Amalthea gave him strength, and Rhea gave him hope that he was part of something greater. Cronus ruled without fear, yet his certainty was hollow, because the prophecy had not been broken but only hidden from his sight. The swallowed siblings endured in silence, waiting for their release, while Zeus became the one who could bring that release about. History often begins not with grand events but with the routines that make growth possible, and in this case those routines were feeding, teaching, and guarding. For now the boy in the cave remained unseen by the world, but each day of hidden growth made him harder to stop. Life continued in this way, quiet and unnoticed, until the time came when silence would give way to action. Now that Zeus had passed through the earliest stages of childhood, we can turn to the years when he began to grow into himself, because these were the years that quietly prepared him for the role he would one day claim. He was no longer the small infant who survived only because others shielded him. He had become a boy with energy, curiosity, and a growing sense of strength. The prophecy had not disappeared, but for now it remained hidden under the surface, waiting. Cronus still believed he was safe, convinced that he had swallowed every child born to him, and he ruled with a false sense of security. But each season that passed in Crete made the deception harder to sustain, because children grow louder, taller, and harder to hide. These middle years, when Zeus was learning, testing, and preparing, show us how the foundations of courage and leadership were built, not in councils or wars, but in the rhythms of daily care and practice. The cave remained his shelter, but by now it was also a place of training, because every corner of it held a lesson. The mornings carried cool air down from the slopes, sometimes sharp with the smell of herbs crushed underfoot, or salt carried on the wind. Amalthea still lingered near, though Zeus needed less of her milk now, and the sound of her steady hooves echoed like a heartbeat through the cavern. The light shifted across the stone floor in predictable lines, and Zeus began to notice how each day followed a pattern. Outside, narrow paths wound up and down the slopes, and the nymphs began to let him climb further than before, though always under their eyes. The island, once only a refuge, had become his school, and the rocks, winds, and waters tested him in ways that palaces never could. Silence was still their greatest protection, but within that silence, Zeus's world grew larger. From this, he learned that growth did not mean rushing forward, but mastering what was within reach before taking the next step. His guardians played their parts with patience, guiding him in ways that shaped his character as much as his body. Adrastea and Ida continued to care for him, but now they also corrected him with calm words when he was careless, teaching him responsibility alongside freedom. They set tasks for him, lifting small stones, carrying water, arranging herbs, and later helping prepare offerings at the small hearth they kept. Each chore gave him discipline, and showed him that strength was not only about muscle, but also about constancy. Amalthea, still present, gave him stability, and her unwavering nearness reminded him of the value of loyalty. Rhea, when she visited, noticed the change in him with each season. He was taller, his gaze was firmer, and his presence carried a weight that had not been there before. These visits reassured her that her daring plan had been worth the risk. Far away, Cronus remained unaware, still blinded by his own certainty. The swallowed children stayed silent inside him, their fate unresolved, while Zeus gathered strength in a cave he did not know to fear. With each new season, Zeus's abilities widened, and his caretakers understood that concealment could not last forever. He learned to run across uneven ground, to climb higher slopes, and to balance heavier stones in his hands. His energy was boundless, but the nymphs channeled it into skills that would one day serve him. They taught him to listen for the smallest sound outside the cave, to notice changes in the wind, and to return quickly when danger threatened. These lessons, though simple, built a habit of awareness and caution. Sometimes his laughter rang too loud, and they quickly turned it into song or rhythm, so that it blended with natural echoes. Rhea, when she saw him, recognized not just her son but the beginnings of the leader, the prophecy foretold. She understood that the day was coming when silence would not be enough, and that thought gave her both pride and worry. Cronus carried on without a hint of suspicion, but the deception was already beginning to fray, because Zeus was no longer a child who could easily be hidden away. The island itself became a classroom beyond the cave, and Zeus learned lessons from nature as much as from his guardians. He saw how storms gathered over the sea, how rains washed the slopes, and how the sun returned with reliable rhythm. He learned that preparation mattered, because those who stored food and wood before a storm endured it more easily. He shared meals with his caretakers, eating bread, fruit, and fish when they had it. and from these plain foods he gained the strength of routine. He understood, even as a boy, that life was made of patterns: gathering, storing, resting, and returning to work. Rhea sometimes told him short stories during her visits, enough to connect him with the larger family of gods, and with the history that lay behind him. These were not elaborate tales, but fragments, reminders that he belonged to something greater. The swallowed siblings remained silent in Cronus's belly, and their absence weighed on him even though he did not yet know them. Still, he grew in their stead, and his growth became a sign that their time would come again. The meaning of these years is clear when we step back and look at them. Zeus was not yet ready to face his father, but he was preparing, and each day of hidden discipline made that future closer. The nymphs gave him patience, Amalthea gave him steadiness, and Rhea gave him hope. Cronus, thinking himself secure, lived in ignorance of the child who would one day end his rule. The swallowed siblings endured within him, silent but present, waiting for release. In Crete, far from power and noise, Zeus was quietly becoming the one who could make that release possible. Great stories often begin not with thunder but with the small unnoticed acts that build strength: carrying water, climbing a path, lifting a stone. For now, the boy remained hidden in silence, preparing without knowing it, and life continued in this way until the time arrived when he could no longer be kept in the shadows. By now, Zeus had grown beyond the stage of being simply a child hidden in a cave, and he began to show the first signs of power that set him apart. To understand this moment, we need to see how his early lessons of patience and survival turned slowly into the beginnings of command and presence. He was still young, still far from the image of a king of the gods, but his guardians could sense that the child they had kept safe was no longer only their charge. Each season gave him new strength, and each task he learned revealed more of the qualities that would define him later. Cronus remained in ignorance, ruling as though nothing could threaten him, yet the very act of ruling in that way created the space Zeus needed to grow stronger in secret. What we witness in these years is not an open clash but a steady gathering of ability, a quiet preparation for the storm that would one day break. These details may seem plain, yet they matter, because this is the stage when Zeus stopped being only a boy who survived and became one who could shape the future. The island of Crete offered him a wider stage than before, and he began to venture beyond the cave under watchful eyes. The mornings often opened with a cool wind blowing down from the slopes, carrying the smell of herbs crushed underfoot. Paths stretched farther than he had walked before, and he tested himself on the uneven ground. He lifted heavier stones now, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to feel his own strength. Amalthea no longer fed him as she had in infancy, yet her steady presence still gave him reassurance, and her hooves echoed a sound of constancy through the cavern. The nymphs Adrastea and Ida, patient as ever, shifted from caretakers to instructors, urging him to master not just play but practice. They guided him in climbing, in running along ridges, in listening for subtle changes in the wind, because all of these skills prepared him for what lay beyond childhood. Rhea, on her careful visits, saw the change in her son, and carried away hope that her gamble had succeeded. Cronus, far away, continued his reign, oblivious to the fact that his rival was no longer a helpless infant, but a boy learning to stand firmly in the world. In this period, Zeus's guardians noticed something more than ordinary growth. He was strong, yes, but he also carried a certain weight in the way he looked and listened. When he spoke, even as a boy, there was focus in his words, and when he acted, there was intent. These qualities came not from lessons written down, but from the life he lived in hiding, where every action mattered and every mistake could carry risk. Adrastea and Ida reinforced these habits by teaching him to think before acting, to move with awareness, and to care for those around him. Amalthea, though only an animal, shaped him too, because her quiet loyalty and her tireless giving of milk had been his first example of constancy. Rhea's brief visits were reminders of his connection to a wider family, and though they were short, they gave him a sense of belonging beyond the cave. Cronus, unaware of these developments, still believed himself safe, but his blindness was the very thing that allowed Zeus to gain strength unnoticed. The swallowed siblings remained within him, their voices silent, but their fate tied to the brother who was now gathering the power to free them. Zeus began to show his energy in ways that even his guardians had not expected. He could run longer distances across the slopes, climb higher rocks, and balance for longer on narrow paths. The nymphs tried to keep him hidden, yet his growing spirit pushed outward, seeking challenges. When storms rolled across the sea and into the mountains, he would stand at the cave mouth and watch them, his eyes fixed on the lightning and the rolling clouds. It was as if the elements called to him, though he could not yet answer. The caretakers managed his impulses with patience, teaching him to wait, to observe, and to learn from what he saw rather than rushing toward it. In this way, his strength became tempered by restraint, and restraint made his strength useful. Rhea, when she visited, noticed these changes with both pride and caution, because she knew the more he grew, the harder it would be to conceal him. Cronus's ignorance still held, but time was slowly working against secrecy, because Zeus was no longer a boy who could be kept in shadow. Each step he took forward made the prophecy more certain. It is important to remember that these years were not marked by battles or councils, but by chores and lessons that look small on the surface. Zeus helped gather herbs, carried bundles of sticks, and watched as the nymphs prepared food. He learned when to keep quiet and when to speak, when to hold back and when to step forward. He studied the rhythms of nature, the turning of seasons, the growth of plants, the habits of animals. These lessons, taught without words, gave him an understanding of the balance that holds the world together. Even as a child, he saw that strength without balance was wasted. The swallowed siblings remained silent, yet their absence taught him the weight of responsibility, because he was the one left free. Cronus ruled in arrogance, thinking his line secure, but each season added to the quiet power gathering in Crete. These years mattered because they laid down the habits of leadership, patience, observation, and measured action. Looking back, we can see that the first signs of power in Zeus were not thunderbolts or commands, but steadiness, awareness, and the ability to grow without being noticed. His caretakers shaped him with patience. Amalthea gave him strength by her simple presence, and Rhea gave him hope through her visits. Cronus, blind to it all, sat secure on his throne, yet his fate was already sealed because his youngest son was preparing in silence. The swallowed siblings endured within him, but their time would come, and their freedom would rest on the boy who now carried the weight of their future. The lesson here is that greatness often begins quietly, in simple acts repeated until they shape character. For Zeus, the acts were climbing rocks, carrying water, listening for the wind, and learning when to wait. These plain beginnings gave him the grounding to rise, and life continued in this way until the day arrived when silence would give way to the first steps of open defiance. By the time Zeus grew into early manhood, we can see that the years of hiding had already done their work, because he carried strength that was quiet rather than showy, and he knew how to wait as well as how to act. The prophecy had not vanished, and Cronus still believed himself secure, yet the threads of change were beginning to gather in places he did not watch. Rhea understood that concealment could not continue forever, since a grown son cannot be tucked behind a cave wall without risk, and she began to think not only about safety, but about timing. Zeus listened when she spoke, and he listened even more closely when she paused, because he had learned that what is left unsaid often matters most. We remain for a moment in Crete, not to repeat the old scenes but to notice how the boy became a planner, and how planning required something different from lifting stones or climbing slopes. It required allies, and it required a path that did not begin with a shout. The air in the cave stayed cool, even as the seasons turned, and in that steady air a new direction took form. The time had come to move from surviving to preparing a first strike that would not look like a strike at all. Rhea did not act alone because she knew that wisdom is a kind of strength, and strength without wisdom can fail at the first hard turn. She sought out Metis, whose counsel was valued for being careful, patient, and exact, and she asked her to guide the next steps. Metis did not promise thunder or spectacle, and Zeus respected her for that, since he had grown up in a place where noise was a liability rather than a prize. She spoke plainly about the problem. Cronus would not be defeated by force at the start, because force without an opening would be crushed. What was needed first was a change inside the king himself, a breaking of the seal he had placed on his own family. Zeus would have to free his swallowed siblings before any larger stand could be made, and he would have to do it in a way that did not announce itself until it was done. Metis offered a plan as clean as it was risky, a draught that would set Cronus's stomach against what it held, and the means for Zeus to place that draught in the king's hand. The wind outside carried a salt edge from the sea, and with that edge in the air, the first clear strategy settled into words. To make such a plan real, allies were needed, and allies had to be chosen with care, because a plan spread too widely loses its shape. Rhea could open doors that remained shut to others, so she arranged a path for Zeus to approach the court without being recognized as a threat. Metis would be the mind at his side, advising him when to speak and when to remain silent, and she prepared the draught with a precision that left little room for doubt. There were others who could be trusted at the edges, small hands who knew how to pass a cup at the right moment, or to shift a schedule so that the right people stood in the right place, and these quiet helpers were more valuable than a host of loud champions. Zeus did not demand oaths. He asked for steadiness, because he knew from Crete that steadiness wins long games. Amalthea remained behind, her role complete, and the nymphs understood that their work had turned from guarding a child to letting a young man step forward. Rhea watched all of this with a calm face, because calm faces do not draw suspicion, and the habit of calm had kept her alive under Cronus's gaze. The world beyond the cave had grown complicated, yet the plan itself stayed simple. Reach the court, stand close, and let the king drink what would loosen his hold. The first movements toward the court had to look ordinary, and so they were, because disguise in plain sight is stronger than any mask. Zeus would not arrive as a challenger or as a guest of honor. He would come as one more hand among many, useful but forgettable, working in a place where cups were poured, tables were set, and schedules were kept. Metis taught him how to vanish without leaving, which is a skill many never learn, how to be present and unnoticed, how to listen while seeming to pass by, and how to stand near power without disturbing its surface. Rhea arranged introductions that did not look like introductions at all, and soon the path was clear for a young man no one worth remarking upon, to serve for a time where Cronus took his meals. The memory of Crete helped, because the same patience needed to quiet laughter in a cave could quiet a heartbeat in a hall. The morning of departure was cool, and the coolness steadied him as he left the island that had kept him alive, since leaving a shelter is always easier when the air itself seems composed. He did not promise victory, he promised effort that would open a door for it. Alongside the practical steps, Metis taught him the rhythm of approach, because timing is the hinge on which plans swing. Zeus learned when a hall is loud enough to hide a soft action, and when a table is busy enough that hands can change places without eyes marking the change. He learned the simple truth that a king often drinks more easily when he believes the moment is his, and he learned that a cup offered at the right time rarely meets doubt. The draught itself was prepared without flourish, because a tool should be a tool and nothing more, and Metis sealed it against time so that it would still work when the moment arrived. Rhea reminded him of the stakes, not by speaking of glory, but by naming his swallowed siblings one by one, since names make duty real. He carried those names quietly, and carrying them gave his steps a weight that did not show. The corridors he would walk were warm with torchlight, and he practiced steady breathing in warm places so that his body would not betray haste. A plan is not a story told once. It is a set of habits rehearsed until the hands can do what the mind intends, and his hands had learned that discipline in a cave. It is easy to imagine that courage bursts only at the final moment, yet most courage is built long before that, and Zeus built his the same way he built muscle, with repetition. He practiced holding a cup smoothly at the wrist, because smooth wrists are less memorable than dramatic gestures. He practiced standing at different distances from a seated figure, because distance changes attention, and attention changes risk. He practiced how to move when a hall is crowded, and how to pause when it suddenly quiets, because quiet exposes. Metis tested him by changing the order of small tasks, so that he learnt to adjust without drawing notice, and she reminded him that the best actor in a court is the one who does not seem to be acting. Rhea said little about Cronus himself, because there was no point in stirring anger before there was something useful to do with it. Zeus kept his voice even, and he kept his thoughts tied to simple actions, since simple actions were the bridge from plan to result. The smell of pitch from torches clung to training rooms, and that bitter scent anchored his practice to a real world rather than a dream of heroism, which is exactly where practice belongs. When the plan was ready, they did not announce it, because nothing weakens a plan like the noise of its own arrival. The path into the court lay open in the most ordinary way, and Zeus stepped onto it without ceremony, carrying the quiet of his childhood into a place that believed itself safe. He did not go alone, because Metis would be near enough to guide the rhythm, and there were helpers placed where they needed to be, though none of them carried weapons. Rhea returned to the habit that had saved her for years, watchfulness without motion, since sometimes the best help is to stay where no one thinks to look. Cronus, for his part, sat within the same patterns he had always trusted, and patterns are exactly what plans use to find their openings. The hall where he took his drink smelled of warmed oil, a detail anyone might notice and then forget, and forgetting small things is how large things begin. The aim was simple: create one natural moment in which a cup would be offered and accepted, and let the draught do what it was prepared to do. No trumpets would sound, and no banners would fall. There would be a swallow, a pause, and then the return of names that had been held too long. Before the first step turned into the second, Zeus allowed himself a last look back, not to the cave as a place, but to the years inside it, because those years had taught him how to finish what he started. He thought of the nymphs who had steadied his hands, of Amalthea whose constancy had fed him, and of Rhea who had carried both grief and resolve without breaking. He did not frame any of this as destiny spoken in shining words. He framed it as work carried out carefully by people who understood why it mattered. The plan was not the end of the story, since freeing the swallowed children would only begin the larger struggle, and Metis made that clear so that victory would not be mistaken for completion. Still, beginnings are earned, not given, and this one had been earned by patience and by practice. The air in the passage before the hall felt still, and still air is good for steady breathing when the time to act finally arrives. What came next would set the pieces in motion, and it would do so without shouting, because the strongest changes often enter quietly. For now it is enough to say that the first plan was in place, the path to the cup had been prepared, and the story of concealment was about to become a story of release. Chapter 7. Storms and Quieting Hands. After the order of Olympus settled, new tests rose to meet Zeus. They were not long wars, but they were sharp and near. The first came up from the broken places of the earth, a challenger named Typhon whose strength pressed against the sky. The second came from within the family itself, a short revolt that tried the bonds among the gods. Zeus faced both in turn, not with haste but with steady moves and the help of those who had stood with him before. The weight of the throne held firm, though it bent for a moment under strain. Friendships made in older battles mattered again. Old crafts and quick hands mattered as much as thunder and law. These events did not undo the calm that had been built after the Titans fell, they only tested it. A low rumble lingered in the clouds. In these years, the high peaks and wide islands lay under a settled path of days. Winds ran in their usual rounds, and the sea and fields moved with the seasons. Around the rocky slopes where fire had once broken free, the ground held old heat in deep seams. By late summer, the air over those slopes rested in a stillness that made voices carry far. Fishermen kept to their coves. Herdsmen walked the ridges with measured steps. Near certain vents and clefts, a faint smell of sulphur hung from the stones. In the halls on Olympus, councils went on in their time, and feasts came and went in order. Life across the lands and waters felt close to the balance Zeus had promised after the lot casting with his brothers. These customs would continue in the years ahead. The figures who stood at the center were known by steady names. Zeus guided councils and guarded oaths. Hera kept her seat beside him and watched the households of gods and mortals. Poseidon minded the seas and the restless edges of the earth. Athena gave counsel and craft. Hermes carried messages and found quiet paths where others would not think to look. He had a ready skill with hidden things. The Hecatoncheires remained in memory as firm friends from earlier days, and among them Briareus was still named when old help was needed. Aegipan, a rustic god of the high pastures, kept to his hills and cliffs, but his ears were quick to trouble. Gaia, patient and wide, bore her own thoughts after the Titans were bound, and from those thoughts came Typhon. The Cyclopes still worked with thunder and weight, though their shops were far from the day-to-day talk. In the great hall of Olympus, the stone benches felt cool. Typhon rose where the earth had deep wounds and new heat. He carried a strength that pushed even steady minds to care. When he stood against Zeus, the first exchange was swift. Thunder moved, and fire struck the air, and the challenger gave ground, then closed again with stubborn will. The fight stretched across ridges and valleys in plain steps. In one turn, Typhon pressed close and caught Zeus with a quick reach. The old stories said that Zeus fell and his sinews were taken away and hidden in a cave. Hermes heard of this and did not wait. He found Agapan near a high spring, and the two of them followed a quiet track toward the place of hiding. They moved with care and found the guarded bundle. Hermes took up the sinews, and Agapan watched the mouth of the cave. They brought the strength back to Zeus. When Zeus stood up again, he did not rush. He tested his limbs, and then went out to meet Typhon a second time. The ground shuddered once. Step by step, Zeus drove the challenger across the land and toward the sea. By the end, Typhon lay under heavy mountain weight where fire had old paths. People in later years pointed to those slopes and said the heat spoke of that day. The name of the mountain was known, but those details changed with the teller. The settled truth was simple. Typhon rose, and Zeus put him down. Not long after that, the quiet on Olympus faced a smaller strain. A few gods grew restless with the pace of Zeus's rule. Hera, Poseidon, and Athena weighed their doubts together. Their thoughts did not seek ruin, but they looked for more say and a shorter reach from the throne. In a careful hour they bound Zeus with fine chains and measured knots. It was done without noise. Hermes was not part of their plan. When the deed was set, word went out in a whisper to an old ally. Briareus, counted among the Hecatoncheires, came up the safe slopes and into the hall without delay. He had stood with Zeus when the Titans fell, and his presence carried a memory of that oath. He set his many hands to the bonds and worked them loose. The lamps in the hall burned low. The conspirators saw him and stepped back. Zeus stood up and looked at each one in turn. He spoke plain words about measure, trust, and the weight of shared order. There were no loud blows. The three set down their rivalry and returned to their work. In the days that followed, Zeus settled certain matters with clear lines. The households resumed their steady rhythm. Life among the gods returned to its calm path during these years. When people told these events later, they marked a simple lesson. The first test showed that storms from the deep earth still came, and that quick minds and old friendships mattered as much as thunder. The second test showed that order could bend without breaking, and that bonds made in hard times held their value. Near the vents and slopes where Typhon lay, travelers pointed to smoke and heat, and remembered a time when the world shook. In the halls of Olympus, the chairs and councils kept their regular places. Stories of Briareus freeing his king were repeated in quiet gatherings, and the names of Hermes and Agrippon were kept with care. In the seasons that came next, the children of Zeus and many unions would begin to take their own paths, and small changes would spread across fields and streets. The king's steadiness held through those turns. A light breeze moved across the high peak, and life continued in this way. After storms and uprisings had tested Olympus, quieter years followed, and in those years Zeus's household widened with children who came from many unions. Some were born of goddesses, others of mortal women, and each carried gifts that reached into daily life. Together they shaped how people understood the world, because they gave names and forms to skills, duties and comforts that had once felt uncertain. Athena brought wisdom and the crafts of city and hand, while Apollo carried the order of prophecy and the steady rhythm of song. Artemis guarded the young and watched over the balance of the hunt. Hermes guided travelers on rough roads and brought fairness to exchanges. Ares stood for the harsh side of battle, though in time even he taught restraint within that field. Dionysus brought the vine, the cup, and the kind of release that eased the strain of labor. The Muses guarded memory and gave music and story their shape. The Graces softened gatherings with gestures of kindness. Persephone carried the cycle of seasons with Demeter. Hebe preserved youth at feasts. Eileithyia eased the pains of birth, and Hephaestus gave houses hinges and tools their strong edge. Each name found a place, and each story helped tie scattered valleys and islands to the high halls of Olympus. Life across the lands seemed steadier because the gods now touched many corners of living, and through them Zeus's order extended into homes, markets and fields. The settings of these births and stories spread across wide ground, because each union left its trace in a different place. On Delos, an island that rose clean from the sea, Leto found rest when the time came for Apollo and Artemis. In Arcadia, Maia, one of Atlas's daughters, raised Hermes in a quiet cave away from crowded places. In Thebes, Semele carried Dionysus, her story unfolding in secrecy until it ended suddenly, and the child was carried to safety. In Thrace and northern lands, the name of Ares carried weight, especially among groups who lived near contested borders. On Helicon and Pieria, the Muses stood near those who shaped words into song and memory. In Attica, people spoke of Athena's protection and tied her care to the rising life of their city. Each story carried not only a birth but a mark upon the land, because shrines and customs took root where these events were remembered. Along shores like Delos, boats tied their ropes, families traded goods hand to hand, and the water lapped steadily at the stones. Life in towns and valleys moved calmly through these years, while stories of the children spread from hearths to markets, and from markets to distant coasts. The ties among these children formed a web of kinship that reflected the breadth of Zeus's own life. Athena came after Zeus had taken Metis into his keeping, and people said her birth proved that wisdom could be born fully formed. Leto, steady and patient, brought Apollo and Artemis, and both stood with him in different ways. Maia, quiet and thoughtful, gave him Hermes, who was quick of hand and mind. Hera bore Aias, and in some tellings, Hephaestus alone, a god of fire and tools. With Semele came Dionysus, carried to safety after his mother's fate ended too soon. With Demeter, Zeus fathered Persephone, whose presence shaped the turning of crops and the division of the year. With Mnemosyne came the Muses, whose voices gave memory and speech to those who would tell stories. With Eurynome came the Graces, whose calm gestures softened gatherings. With Hera also came Hebe and Eileithyia, who cared for youth and birth. Each child had a place, and together they mapped a family that touched nearly every corner of life. The plainest households could feel close to Olympus, because in the birth of a child, the turn of a crop, the rhythm of a feast, or the shaping of a tool, there was a divine name to steady the moment. The events of these births were often told in steps, and each step became part of tradition. When Zeus's head ached with sharp pressure, Hephaestus split it open with a stroke, and Athena appeared, grown and ready, a figure of thought and skill. On Delos, when Leto found ground that would hold her, she brought Apollo and Artemis into the light. Apollo soon took his place at Delphi, offering clear words for those who sought direction, while Artemis claimed the woods and riversides, guarding youth and wild balance. Maia bore Hermes in secret, and he showed his wit early. crafting a lyre from a shell, and striking a bargain with Apollo that set patterns for exchange and reconciliation. Ares took on the burden of battle, his name carried into the rules that framed contests. Semele, who bore Dionysus, fell when her time was cut short, but Zeus saved the child, and he was raised later on distant hills, cared for by kind nurses. The Muses gave their songs and voices to poets and elders, shaping memory into order. The Graces kept gatherings kind. These stories carried details that people repeated, because the details explained why a city had a patron, why a rite was performed, or why a festival returned each year. From simple accounts of births and first deeds came traditions that lasted centuries. The impact of these children unfolded not only in myth but in daily habits. In Athens, people honored Athena with festivals and set their work under her care, tying law and craft to her presence. At Delphi, Apollo's seat drew pilgrims who came for guidance, and his words were weighed before choices were made. Artemis stood near river mouths and clearings, where families left gifts for the safety of the young. Hermes watched over markets where weights were measured and exchanges kept fair, and he guarded travelers on roads that bent through dusk. Mars received vows from soldiers who promised to fight with measure and return home if they could. Dionysus' rites brought the tending of vines, the sharing of cups and the release that followed long labor, and from his festivals grew plays that told stories of fault and repair within a city. The Muses gave strength to memory and speech, and the Graces softened gatherings. Persephone's return and descent shaped the farming year, and people trusted the rhythm she brought. Hephaestus gave strength to hinges, plows, and crafted tools, making work easier. These gifts did not seem distant. They entered into homes, fields, and markets, becoming part of how people lived. Through the children, the order of Olympus reached into daily life without need of constant thunder. In the larger view, the children of Zeus created a map of the world as people experienced it. Wisdom and counsel had their place, as did craft and fire. Prophecy and song gave meaning, while exchange and travel made paths open. War was acknowledged, but framed by rules, and release was given its proper space after long toil. Seasons were set in a cycle that could be trusted, and birth and youth had divine guardians. No single child carried everything, but together they carried enough to give shape to life. Olympus itself stayed whole because this web of kinship reinforced bonds that might otherwise fray. In time, the paths of mortals and gods would cross more directly, because heroes would rise whose lives matched the patterns already set by these divine children. For now, people told stories of births, of skills given, and of customs shaped, and these stories linked valley to valley and island to island. When elders finished their accounts by the hearth, they ended with the simple truth that the children of Zeus had spread order across the world in many directions. Life went on in this way, steady and sure, under a sky that seemed calmer for their presence. As the halls of Olympus settled into their steady rhythm, Zeus began to turn his attention more closely to mortals, because the great wars were finished, and what mattered now was the balance of daily living. The struggles with titans and storms had passed, and in their place rose questions of household order, fair exchanges, and the limits between divine gifts and human duty. Prometheus stood at the center of this turning point, because his cleverness brought fire into mortal hands, and his boldness forced Zeus to make choices about justice and restraint. From that choice came Pandora, whose story showed how burdens and blessings often arrive together. Later came Heracles, whose strength was unmatched but who needed direction, so that his power would serve law and not break it. In these years, Zeus did not rule by thunder alone, he ruled by measure, shaping customs that mortals could carry in their homes and fields. The story of fire, of jars, of floods, and of labors shows how order spread, not just to gods but to men, so that life could be lived without fear of sudden ruin. The setting of these stories was not one single place but a wide land of coasts, valleys, and hills, where households were small and temples were simple. Villages built low walls, farmers cut their fields in strips, and neighbors marked their boundaries with stones. Fires burned in kitchens, not in great forges, and smoke curled above the roofs in soft lines. At altars, families offered bones and fat in thanks, while keeping the meat for themselves, because sacrifices had already been shaped by old bargains. Messengers moved along dusty paths, carrying not just goods but words, binding one town's stories to another's. The sea touched nearly every community, bringing grain, wine, and tales from distant shores, and its rhythm matched the rhythm of daily life. Zeus did not walk openly among mortals, yet he watched over oaths and sent signs more often through calm weather than through storms. A quiet hearth, a guarded threshold, and an honest promise became the signs of his care in these years. Prometheus stood out among the kin of gods because he leaned toward the side of men. His name meant foresight, and he used it to shape divisions and clever solutions. At Mycenae, he set before Zeus 2 portions from a single ox, one a pile of bones dressed in shining fat, and the other the good meat hidden under rough hide. Zeus chose the portion that looked pleasing but held no nourishment, and from that choice sacrifices were ordered. Fat and bone burned to the gods, meat kept for men. Prometheus had set the pattern, and it stayed. Yet Zeus saw the slight in the trick, and he drew back fire from mortals so that they would feel the cost of guile. Prometheus did not accept the decision. He stole fire in a hollow stalk, carried it in secret, and placed it in mortal hands. Hearths glowed again, cooking and craft returned, and people felt warmed by what had been denied. Zeus's answer was not swift but firm. He bound Prometheus to a remote cliff and set an eagle to tear at him each day, with his body renewed each night so the punishment never ended. That rock, battered by wind, stood as a lesson to all who looked too far past measure. Yet Zeus did not end the matter with punishment. He answered with balance, creating a new gift that would walk among mortals and teach them that joy and burden often arrive together. Hephaestus shaped the form of a woman, and Athena dressed her with skill, while Hermes gave her a lively wit, Hera gave dignity, and other gods added small graces, so that she was pleasing in every detail. They called her Pandora, the all-gifted, and she carried with her a jar sealed with what men had not known before. When she opened it, cares and sickness, toil and hunger flew out and spread into human life, and from that day work was harder and days were shorter. At the bottom of the jar, however, hope remained, and it stayed with mortals as a companion to their burdens. In this way Zeus did not take back fire, but he made sure that fire was balanced with care. The story spread quickly, and every household that looked to its hearth remembered that what brightens also carries weight. In another season, a flood washed across the land, because people had bent customs too far and needed to be reset. Deucalion and Pyrrha, descended from Prometheus, endured the waters and began again, after the storm passed. Their survival became a reminder that even destruction can be followed by renewal, and that life can be built again from patience and work. Later came Heracles, born of Zeus and Alcmene, whose strength exceeded that of any mortal but whose spirit needed guiding. A king named Eurystheus set him 12 tasks, each one meant to shape his power into service rather than chaos. He cleared wild places, captured beasts, and faced labors that would test his judgment as much as his strength. In time, Heracles came upon the rock where Prometheus still lay bound. He killed the eagle that tormented him, and asked Zeus to allow the chains to be broken. Zeus agreed, not because the punishment had been forgotten, but because a pledge was made that bound Prometheus within order again. With that, an old wound in the family was closed, and fire remained in human hands with limits more clearly set. The lessons from these stories were plain, though they carried weight. Prometheus's cleverness showed the cost of guile, but also gave men the means to cook and craft. Pandora's jar taught that every gift comes with care, but hope would never leave, and that reminder kept people steady in hard times. Deucalion and Pyrrha taught that renewal was possible, and that patience could rebuild even after loss. Heracles proved that strength mattered most when yoked to restraint, and his labors showed that might without measure can cause more harm than good. Together these figures set examples that traveled far, carried by traders to markets and by shepherds across valleys. At feasts and at oracles their names were repeated, and the plain advice they represented was woven into customs. Keep promises, honor roofs and tables, and remember that even fire must be tended carefully. Looking back, we see that Zeus guided these years with steadiness, not with heavy hand or soft indulgence, but with balance. He allowed fire, but he reminded men of its cost. He allowed gifts, but he made sure hope remained when burdens entered. He allowed heroes to rise, but he placed their steps under law. The flame on a hearth, the turning of a plough, the stories told at a gate or by a fire, all carried these lessons forward. Mortals felt closer to the order of Olympus, not when thunder split the sky, but when their own lives seemed to echo the same patterns of restraint and renewal. For now the world carried on with new fires burning, jars closed but remembered, and tasks completed under measure. Life continued in this way, steady and lived, under a sky that no longer frightened as it once had. As the years after the great councils of Olympus passed, the way people honored Zeus took shape not only in stories but in the habits of ordinary life. Because memory of battles and thrones fades, yet customs endure. Families brought small offerings to hearths and altars, promising honesty in trade and peace in their households. They gathered under roofs, raised by many hands, or in open fields where space was shared. They held games that turned rivalry into order, and they kept oracles where chosen voices offered guidance in measured words. These practices spread steadily from valley to valley, from one season to the next, until they knit distant towns into a shared rhythm. The name of Zeus came to mean oath and fairness, guest right and balance, and it stood as a reminder that strength could be calm and judgment could be patient. In mountain villages, in busy ports, in markets where traders weighed grain, his name was spoken quietly, often without thunder at all, yet it carried weight. The sanctuaries where these customs gathered were as varied as the land itself. At Olympia, between two riverbanks and low hills, people raised a space where Zeus would be honored with contests. Far to the north at Dodona, an ancient oak grew inside a fenced ground, its leaves whispering in the breeze, and seers listened for meaning in those sounds. In Arcadia, old altars stood on ridges where the air was sharp and clean. In towns, public hearths burned in squares where disputes were settled by elders. On islands like Delos, and in coastal cities such as Massalia or Syracuse, shrines named for Zeus gave sailors and merchants a place to pause. Some sanctuaries watched over flocks and vineyards, while others stood by harbors facing the sea. In Attica, Zeus Kessios was honored near storerooms, because families asked for plain sufficiency. In markets, Zeus Agoraios was invoked so that sellers and buyers would act fairly. Each shrine reflected the needs of its place, yet the heart remained the same: order, fairness, and welcome. Travelers crossing ridges or entering towns found that they could join these spaces without fear, because the ground was marked by customs everyone recognized. The people who tended these sanctuaries filled specific roles, and their duties were woven into daily life. In Elykes, the officials who judged the games swore before an image of Zeus to be fair, and their patience gave contests meaning. At Dodona, attendants wrote down questions on thin lead sheets and gave short, practical answers, guiding decisions about travel, marriage, or disputes. In Arcadia, old families passed down the rites on mountain peaks, keeping traditions alive even when little else reached those heights. In markets, clerks weighed goods and spoke Zeus's name when declaring measures honest. Artists carved wood and shaped stone, cooling tempers by giving faces to ideals, and builders raised halls where images could be kept safe. Phidias, remembered for the great statue at Olympia, worked with care so that the seated figure of Zeus looked calm and unyielding. Kings, too, made their way to sanctuaries. Alexander of Macedon travelled far into the desert to hear Zeus Ammon at Siwa, believing that even at the edge of sand and spring, the voice of order could still be found. Local councils arranged funds for festivals, prepared food for visitors, and saw that torches, oil, and wreaths were ready when needed. Families joined in these customs. Sons ran in races, daughters sang in choruses, and elders carried baskets of barley to altars. Even a bronze bell struck flat and plain was enough to mark a day's rite. Step by step, the games at Olympia grew into one of the clearest signs of Zeus's place in the lives of many. Months before the festival, heralds travelled from city to city announcing a truce so that athletes and travellers could reach Elyssus safely. Young men trained under the sun, running barefoot on packed earth, lifting stones and preparing their bodies for contests. When they arrived, they swore oaths to Zeus, and their trainers did the same, promising fairness and effort. Sacrifices were offered, and the order of events was posted for all to see. Races opened the program, first short dashes, then longer runs that tested stamina and control. Wrestling, boxing, and pancration followed, each demanding strength but also restraint. The pentathlon balanced multiple skills: running, jumping, discus, javelin, and wrestling, reminding all that no single talent was enough without others. Winners stood before the judges and received wreaths cut from sacred olive trees, their names written down by scribes who preserved them for future years. News of victories spread quickly, carried by travelers back to distant towns, where families feasted and placed wreaths above their doors. In other valleys, like Nemea, similar games were held, and though smaller, they followed the same rules and oaths. Far away, people still walked to Dodona, where seers gave short replies, steady and useful, to guide choices about life. Through these customs, order stretched across the land in ways no sword could enforce. Generations passed, and the reach of Zeus's worship widened. Colonists carried his name across seas, raising altars on new coasts and setting up contests patterned after Olympia. In Asia Minor, sanctuaries appeared on ridges and by rivers, repeating old rites in new settings. In Egypt, Zeus Ammon was honored at Siwa, where the desert air was still and the spring was deep, and Alexander himself came to hear its voice. The statue at Olympia stood through many years, washed and maintained by skilled hands who understood its frame. Coins carried the image of Zeus, seated with a staff, his eagle at his side, and these coins passed through countless hands in markets. Later in Rome, the high god Jupiter was seen as a counterpart to Zeus, and though the names differed, many felt the meaning was shared: order, oaths, and guardianship of law. Time changed many things. Some oracles grew quiet, some games were ended by later rulers, and temples fell into silence. Yet even when roofs collapsed and sanctuaries emptied, the memory remained in worn stones, in faint inscriptions, and in the habits of speech that tied fairness to the name of Zeus. Looking back, the meaning of these centuries of practice becomes clear. Zeus came to stand not only for the roar of storms or the rule of Olympus, but for the small, steady customs that kept households, markets, and cities at peace. He was the witness to promises, the guardian of fair waits, the reminder that guests must be welcomed, and the calm presence in courts and councils. His image seated with a staff became more than art. It was a sign that judgment could be patient, and that order could endure beyond quarrels. The old stories of his birth, his struggles, and his rise to power softened into a background, while the habits of ritual, games, and oaths remained part of daily life. People taught their children when to speak, when to listen, and how to honor the balance between freedom and duty, and these lessons kept communities steady. In this way Zeus endured, not because thunder struck often, but because calm routines carried his presence forward. A breeze passed through the leaves of the oak at Dodona, steady and familiar, and life continued in this way, season after season. And so, dear knight, our tale of Zeus, the thunderer of Olympus, comes to an end. May your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams carry you among the gods themselves. Until our next story, ride onward beneath the stars. Good night.